You're about to listen to the Complete Developer Podcast, the podcast by coders, for coders, about all aspects of life as a developer.
I'm Will, the curmudgeonly experienced developer.
And I'm Beej, the optimistic newbie developer. Welcome to another episode of Complete Developer Podcast. This week, we're talking about code katas and how to use them to improve your skills as a developer. Also, we'll discuss how to use them as a testing ground for new development concepts. Will and I will also give you a rundown of how we used them successfully in the past so that you can use some of our experiences to help you with your own. But first, Will, what have you been fighting this week?
Well, I haven't been fighting. I've just been enjoying messing around with Node and Mongo and using the Vash view engine.
I've not used Vash.
It's a lot like Razor. It reminds me a lot of Razor. It was actually, all three of these were recommended by Sean Wildermuth. He's got a pretty good video series on Pluralsight for about Node.js for ASP.NET developers. And so he kind of explains, fits all the pieces together where it's, something and then here's the new thing.
Okay,
and he really bridged the gap for me a lot, especially on the way some of the controller stuff works, and it's been pretty helpful. So I've been playing with that a lot. I'm borderline considering switching platforms, especially if the side business ends up not working out. Because I want to be off the Microsoft stack and out of this ecosystem, if that's the case.
Yeah, you've talked about that a bit in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of stuck because I have stuff on there, and like my day-to-day job is that, but that doesn't mean that at some point in the future that it has to be. And so I'm kind of hedging my options on that one, and so that's why I'm doing the Node stuff. So how about you?
We recently had the Code Newbie Nashville first community coding event.
And that was fun.
That was awesome. We left there and went to lunch afterwards, and we're just like hyped up.
Yeah.
Because it was so much fun, and which is odd for you because you normally get worn down by social.
Oh, I crashed when I got home.
Okay.
But it didn't hit me for a while, which is unusual. It was a good 3 or 4 hours after.
Yeah, we had a great time. A lot of great people came out.
And you actually did code katas.
Yeah, that's right. We did. You spoke and talked to us about code katas, which is really funny because you told me the topic.
Yeah,
and I said, "Oh, I've been working on an outline for that," and you said, "Well, so have I."
Yeah,
and so this is kind of the combination of, it's mostly your outline with little interjections from me from what I'd been working on, but. Let's go ahead and get on into it and roll the music. This week for IoTs, I have a fun family project called the BuddyBot. And this is a robot programmed entirely in Swift. So our iOS devs can have some fun too. This was a project, I got it from a blog that was created by a Swift programmer and his daughter. They built the original BuddyBot as a summer project when she was out of school. So it's great for families with kids in elementary school. You can even do it because components, while they can be soldered, they can also be attached via solderless breadboard. I've talked about different projects. Some had very good tutorials and some did not have very good tutorials, but the projects were interesting. This is one that's an interesting project with phenomenal tutorial. They actually created a blog just for this.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and I've got the link to it in the show notes. But the really cool thing to be on the lookout for is they recently built their first BattleBot. And the BuddyBot itself is built on the Rover 5 chassis with the Rover 5 motor control board and then the Beagle board as its controller. And the actual hardware is quite a long list. I'm not going to go into all the details because the updates add even more. But the software is pretty much just Swifty Bones and BeagleBone Black, which is the BeagleBoard's OS. And it's really awesome because he talks, there's videos and pictures, and he kind of talks through how they built it and like how his daughter helped out, and then they've got pictures of some of the awards that they've won from it.
That's really, really cool.
Yeah, I just think this is a great family project especially for those like you. You have a daughter that's about the same age that, if she were interested, you guys could probably do this.
Yeah, she always says that I don't want to be a code monkey.
Yeah, she does say that. Yeah. Literally. That's the phrase she uses. She wants to be a teacher like her mom, right?
Yeah.
At least that's what she wants to do now.
Yeah.
So do we have a comment this week?
We do not, but we do have something from an in-person conversation.
That's right.
Stuart Terry, who is a recruiter here in Nashville, said that he enjoyed the episode with Lena. That would be the one on recruiters. Mm-hmm. So much that he asked the other recruiters in the office to listen so they could better be able to explain their role.
Yeah. He told me that over the phone. Thanks, Stu. We've got some complete developer swag just for you. And if you'd like some swag, leave us a comment. Remember, y'all, we do read these, and if you enjoy the show, help us out by leaving us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. We're trying to boost ourselves up to where, we're showing up in the new and noteworthy and things like that.
Where people can find us?
Yeah. So, Will, you gave a really great talk this past Saturday on code katas. Why don't you get us started with what is a code kata?
Well, let's take a step back and define a word here. A kata is a set of practice moves used in the martial arts, which I know you're familiar with as well, to practice techniques in a controlled environment, and it's a repetitive practice. Typically, what you do is you practice forms at slow speeds until the technique is perfected. And the big deal with katas is they're more of a strategic thing. So it's an idea of building up the proper structure, your stance, your form, how you turn around, how you structure your block, and you do it slowly and then gradually build up speed as you get better.
I remember I got into an argument, not really argument, more debate one time on a forum. And I talked about, practice doing things slowly to get the muscle movements down.
And to get rid of wasted movement.
Yeah. Before you really get into focusing on speed. And of course, you get people that are like the mixed martial arts bodybuilder crowd that are very anti that.
I'm 22 and I can have the crap kicked out of me and still get up and go to work in the morning versus somebody who's 45 and that's just not going to happen anymore.
Yeah.
And they can't rely on that. They've got to rely on structure. And this is kind of the same thing. The idea is that you build up a structure so that you're not as easily knocked off balance, so that you are getting rid of inefficient movement by highlighting it. Mm-hmm. And this differs from a drill. This is something we ran across. I think you were showing an article that was talking about why code katas are bad, and it was very, very clear that the person just did not understand the difference between a kata and a drill.
Yes. Everything that they used to say in that article, we're talking about katas as if they were drills.
Right. Because with the kata, you're doing the same thing over and over again, or if you do alter it, you're the one making that decision. Whereas with the drill, you do the same thing over and over again, but it does get altered, but not by you, and you have to react.
Yeah.
It's a difference between a planning, I'm going to practice this thing over and over again and get better, versus I have to be able to react to whatever happens. Mm-hmm. One of those is tactical, one of them strategic. This is the strategic side. We may talk about coding drills at some other point. To be honest, though, you'll get enough drilling just doing a day job.
That's true. And, code katas help you build solid practices in a controlled environment.
The idea here is to create a situation with a known problem space and then use it to safely practice the same thing over and over again until the technique is fluid, solid, and relaxed. In other words, you're not having to think about it.
Yeah, you do it without thought.
Right, and it's under the hood kind of thing, so that you're reacting.
I remember
you're flowing out of.
Yeah, I remember I used to do Tai Chi a lot.
Yeah.
And the idea was when I started learning it, I only learned the first 3 or 4 moves and then practiced those for a month or so before learning the 4th one.
Right.
Because I had to get those to where they were so smooth I could do them half awake.
Right.
Or half drunk, which is usually how my instructor had me do it. But
yeah. And it was built in.
Yeah.
Because you drill it to the point where that's where you are so that you can do other more complicated things on top of that structure.
Yes, exactly. They can also be quite helpful first thing in the morning to get your momentum going.
Yeah. And I mean, they do this in karate as well, right? You'll do katas as a warm up and then you go spar because it just loosens you up and you're kind of in that flow. You can also use them this way.
The Tai Chi class was for an hour, and then right after that was the judo class for an hour. And, not everybody in the Tai Chi class came to the judo class and vice versa. But if you came to both, you got a lot of benefit out of getting that warm up with the Tai Chi and like this, before getting thrown around.
Right. It gives you a static or a beginning structure for the dynamics of what's going to come up next.
Mm-hmm. So now we've kind of talked about what code katas are. Why do we want to do them?
The biggest thing is just having a regular schedule of practice for a known problem in the environment that you're going to be solving problems, particularly like with your development environment, your command line tools, your database environment, dealing with your OS, dealing with all these different bits and pieces that you're going to have to mess with every day to try to actually get something done. You're not trying to write code here, right? You're trying to get used to your environment and get to the point where you can flow with it.
So this is kind of like when I tried to learn the keyboard commands in Visual Studio. It was really slow, especially at first, but I knew that forcing myself to practice doing them later on when I was writing code, I would be a lot faster because I wouldn't have to think, all right, wait, do I do this? And then go, you know what? I'm not sure. So let me just use the mouse.
Well, I mean, and you'll see me do stuff too. And I know you've asked me where you're like, oh, what was the shortcut key that you used for that? And I have no idea anymore.
Yeah.
Because I've drilled it so much that it's not a conscious action and I have to think to recall that. It's always there, but it's like, that's how you build. And I think that's Control-Shift-B. I don't ever think about that. It's like, this is how I move my fingers to build.
Yeah.
And that
it's more like you think, build, and your fingers go where they need to go.
And the big thing here is the practice in using your environment that will help you optimize your flow. So as you're going through these things and doing things slowly, you can see where the bottlenecks are. And it's a problem that you're not emotionally attached to, right? You're not going to get fired if you fail at a code kata.
No, that's true.
Nobody else is going to get fired. The company web server is not going to go down on Black Friday. It gets you out of that mix so that you're handling a problem that doesn't really matter, but it's a practice situation.
Mm-hmm. You can also use them to practice tightening up your code using a known problem space. Maybe using a different language constructs to do so. And it'll help you from getting into a rut.
Yeah. Because, let's say that you're doing everything iteratively, like the way you did your sample.
Yeah.
Well, what's the next phase for you? I pretty well know what it is because I know that you're going to be trying to tighten that up with Link after you saw the way I did mine. Because I started some of it iteratively, but most of it I've done through Link. I used to do it with iteration. But I got comfortable with Link because I was able to continually practice. And I had a problem that it's like, okay, I know I can solve this because I've done it, 50 times before. Now let's see if I can solve it with these other constructs. That separates the problem from the way that you solve it so that you can just fight with one thing at a time. Yeah.
And just so you guys know, because we're going to refer to this quite a bit because we use the kata that I created. And it's taking the primes kata to basically produce a list of prime numbers and putting a little Doctor Who spin on it to produce some happy primes. And for those of y'all that don't know, a happy number is one that when you take the sum of its digits squared and then keep doing that, will eventually go down to 1.
Right.
And then a number that does not, it will repeat indefinitely, and that's an unhappy number or a sad number. And so the code kata, the core one that I did that's on my blog is basically just creating a list of happy primes up to 500. And so, yeah, I did. The first thing I did was the way that I knew how to do it, which is iteratively. So code katas are also an excellent opportunity to practice things like test-driven development, refactoring, which is something that we've talked about with the code that I wrote.
Yeah.
And we talked about at the Code Newbie thing. That was one of the questions too, was, how do you do refactoring? Do you take your code that you wrote yesterday and refactor it, or do you rewrite that code?
Yeah, and you can do both, right? Because
Yeah.
you can do a code kata that is just refactoring, that has a starting point that's, suboptimal code, and then you fix it where it's more optimal, and you can drill that over and over again.
Which actually would be very useful.
Yeah, that's what I did practicing, and I periodically do that again as well.
Yeah. So what kind of problems are suitable for code katas? We talked about the one that I kind of developed from an existing kata, but what are good problems?
Well, you really kind of want short, reasonably simple problems that you can deal with as a unit. So you want, given your schedule, you have a certain amount of time available to do this. There's some people that really legitimately have 8 hours a day because they're not doing anything else, and they can screw around and take an 8-hour problem if that's, really what they want to go do. There's other people, like us that have got, half an hour to an hour to do something. So the entire problem has to be able to fit within that time.
Yeah, you generally want, at least early on, to avoid things that have complicated issues around them, like user interfaces, multi-threading, talking to the database, unless that is the skill you're trying to train.
Right.
Like, I know I've done some API katas because I was really wanting to build up my skills calling APIs and then parsing XML and JSON. And so that's what I did. And it was rough, especially at first. But
the other thing that's bad about some of these things too is, for instance, like talking to a database server. Well, let's say that you're trying to do that and the database server goes down. You have an external risk that can make you burn a whole bunch of time. Now, that can be very instructive for you learning how to troubleshoot that. But if that's not what you're actually after, that's not what you want.
Yeah, and you also want a problem that is scalable, one that can be made more or less difficult.
Yeah, and that's what you did really, really well with your code kata, because what was it? Was it level 0 or level 1? I forget.
Level 1.
It was level 1. You didn't start at 0, counting like a programmer. I'm
well,
so sad.
Here's the thing.
It's probably just as well.
Yeah,
we'd have to explain it.
The original code kata, the kata that I wrote was just level 2, and then when we were talking with Saran about how to set up for the Code Newbie event, she sent me some samples that had this, like, it was the challenge, kind of talking about what the problem was, and then it had 3 levels. And so I thought, well, what I did is probably looking at these other ones a good solid level 2. So let me step back and make a lighter level 1, and then take it a step further to make a more difficult level 3. And so that's what I originally wrote it, and I sent it to you and her, but I think I sent it on Wednesday or Thursday night, and you were busy. You didn't even respond, and then
it got buried in my email. Yeah. So I wasn't particularly aware of all the specifics really until I was there. Yeah, which kind of made it more fun.
Well, anyway. You didn't see the changes I made because Saran and I went back and forth. I say back and forth. Like, she gave me some suggestions, and we talked about those, and she really helped me solidify it to what the final version was, because that's what she's been doing with the other groups and has solid experience with that. But and that's where I got the level 1, the level 2, level 3.
And there was kind of, you had level 1, 2, and 3, and then there was kind of like a level 1.5 in there as part of level 2, because just finding the primes was, that's another good stopping off point. But the big thing was that it was scalable. Like, you could take a problem and you could start out with something a little smaller And then once you've totally got that whipped, you can get a bigger one. And you could scale all the way up to something that, took me, 15 or 20 minutes. And, I've been coding a very long time. Now, granted, if I hadn't completely forgot something I learned in C++ back in college, it would have only been like 5 minutes, which was, rather painful.
Well, one thing that I did that I told Saran about afterwards, too, I was like, I'm being a little bit mean on level 2.
Yeah.
Because I'm a math geek. I'm not like super, super math genius. I like geeky math stuff. And one thing that I didn't point out, and I'll tell our listeners, is
you had a halting problem.
Yes. And if you didn't know the pattern that unhappy numbers take, you didn't know where to stop because it continually iterates and it will just indefinite loop.
Yeah, which I didn't know the pattern, but I was able to write something that would figure it out effectively.
Yeah.
And go on with life. But that was an interesting wrinkle on the thing. It made it, it made it much more difficult at that level.
Yeah. That's the thing that was one thing that when Saran wrote back to me, she's like, I really like it, but I don't think it's, the difference between level 1 and level 2 is challenging enough. And then I wrote back and I told her about that. And she's like, oh, you're not going to tell them that? And I'm like, not until they hit the problem and can't solve it.
Yeah. And I think one of the guys did get like infinite recursion.
Yeah, he did until I told him.
Yeah. And I helped him quite a bit with those pieces because that was a challenging problem.
Well, he was doing it iteratively like I did at first until you came over and helped him after you'd finished. Well, what I loved about that whole event, and guys, this is one of the great things about community coding type events, is we all broke off and we broke up into teams because we had people of different levels. We had some people there who had never coded.
And we had people in languages that we weren't as used to as well.
Which I really enjoyed seeing the Python.
Yes.
Yeah. I thought that was awesome. I was kind of hoping somebody with more of a statistical language would be there, like R or something, but we didn't. I mean, we just didn't have anybody there.
Or a functional.
Yeah.
I was sitting there going, oh man, if we have somebody that gets into a problem in F# and they can't solve it, we can't help them.
Yeah.
Like it's gonna be tricky.
Yeah.
And we would get a pretty abrupt learning experience on that one.
Oh yeah. It would have been fun though.
Oh yeah.
But no, I mean, but it was really awesome because we broke up into teams where like a little bit more experienced coder and some of the less experienced people so that everybody could participate. Then at the end, we all kind of showed the work that we'd done. So like we had the one guy that was a Python programmer. Well, there weren't any other Python programmers there. He pretty much worked solo like you did.
Yeah.
And then we had one guy that had never coded before, and we paired him up with you so that you could kind of walk him through what you were doing.
Because he didn't have even a development environment.
Yeah,
yet.
I mean this was his very first event, and honestly, I'm glad he came out because I think it's great, and I really hope he comes to more events.
He's got the mindset of a developer.
He would really do.
He just hasn't completely unpacked that yet, but when he does, watch out.
Well, what's funny is I didn't know this at the time, but he has a lot of experience in Excel, yeah, and he could have totally done this problem in Excel.
Dominated.
Yeah, and I wish I had known that. I didn't get a chance to talk to him until after the event, and I found that out.
Yeah.
Like, if we had had a chance to talk before and I'd learned that before, I would have told him, I was like, oh, don't worry about trying to download an environment. Do it in Excel because I want to see what you can do with it.
Yeah. That would have been better, but we'll know next time.
All right, so now that we've talked about what are suitable code katas, what are some problems that are not suitable?
Well, anything whose very simplest form takes you over an hour to complete is probably not a good place to start. Now, when you get further up in level, obviously you can do very much more difficult things within an hour than when you're first starting out. So this scales over time.
Yeah, well, that makes sense.
Yeah, because I wouldn't try to implement a feed forward neural network in an hour.
Yeah,
using LINQ. That's not something that would be appropriate for me. Even at my level, there are people that could totally do that. Whereas something that, is like what we had there, the level 3 exercise probably would have been about right. So that's one thing. You don't want it to take so long that you stop and get out of it and go do something else. And you also don't want to be in a position where you're discouraged by the difficulty level and the level of detail. Because bear in mind, you still have to work. You probably do have a job or you're trying to get one. Like you don't want to add something to your life that makes those things more difficult, even if it is for practice.
I will say when I was setting these up, I wanted to practice writing the code to do them. So the kata didn't involve learning about prime numbers and learning about happy numbers.
Because you already knew. Yeah,
I already knew. And in the challenge that I wrote for everybody, I gave an explanation of those at the beginning. The challenge, the challenge in the code kata was writing code that finds those numbers.
Right.
Yeah, not figuring out what those numbers are.
And another corollary to this is if the most difficult form of the problem takes you less than 5-10 minutes to solve, that's probably a little too easy for you. For example, the thing of, okay, find all the prime numbers between 1 and 500, or even finding all the happy numbers. I banged that out very, very quickly. Like that would not have been a sufficient code kata for me.
Well, level 1 wouldn't have been for me because I gave a list of happy numbers and I gave a list of prime numbers. And I was just comparing the two lists.
Yeah.
Which for someone just starting out in code.
Yeah, that's a first project.
Yeah, that really is.
Yeah. But, once you've been doing it a while, there's patterns and things you start to notice and you're able to just kind of do it. Like I could do it basically, you have the list initializations and then you have,
I'll be honest, the way I thought about this when I was taking...
I could have done it in one statement.
Yeah. The way I was thinking about this when I went from, here's the kata that I had for myself that took me about an hour or so to do initially. I was thinking, all right, what would have taken me an hour 2 years ago?
Right.
And that's level 1. And then I thought, all right, what would take me about a day? And that was level 3.
And so you want to be able to manage your time. You also don't want to be wasting time by going, okay, I'm just going to do some little dinky problem that I've already learned everything from. Because the idea here is to extract knowledge and extract practice.
Yeah. And, you're going through this, and we're about to talk about the way that we do these. But you also don't want problems that the solution is wildly different than the type of problem you want to solve.
Right. So, for instance, I wouldn't want to try to, do file processing in assembler because that has no practical application for me personally with where I'm trying to take my career.
Well, yeah.
Whereas, okay, some of the, there are a lot of interesting areas that I could do that are very difficult that aren't that. So you want to try to target it in a direction, not just go, okay, I'm gonna code and get better at coding because that's such a huge field.
Oh yeah,
yeah. It's just not a reasonable goal. That's like trying to take over Asia. It's like not something anybody reasonable does.
It's like it's like learning your first coding language and deciding, oh, this is really cool. I love coding. I want to learn all the coding languages right now.
Yeah,
it's like you don't. There's no polyglot junior developers.
Right. Well, some web developers, but even then, it's goal oriented.
Maybe, yeah.
Because they're going to get some JavaScript, and then they're going to get HTML, and they're going to get CSS, and
well, see, the thing is, I see all those as
right, but then they'll have a back end language too, which may or may not be JavaScript, and they'll have.
Well, see, when I say polyglot, I mean like multiple back end languages,
yeah, multiple fluent.
Yeah.
Things because usually you get good enough to get by with something and then get something really strong and then you work out.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what you want to do here is you want to have a structured practice that points towards a goal.
Mm-hmm. No.
Like when I was doing karate, we had one kata that I really didn't like. And the reason is the way the stances were in that kata was completely different than everything else that we were doing. And I found out that this form is what it was for practicing being able to move side to side in a boat.
Huh.
For basically sea pirates.
Yeah.
and, fighting. And it's a weird way of moving. It just does not work on land, but it was still around.
Well, I mean, boats are still around.
Yeah, but pirates are typically not in Japanese waters. There's pirates off the Horn of Africa, but there's not like that. The context of that thing was not something that you're going to practice because you actually plan to use it. You're LARPing. You don't want to be doing that when you're trying to build a career.
That's a good way of putting it.
So yeah, avoid that. So I guess now's probably a good time to kind of talk a little bit about how I do code katas.
Yeah, so why don't you explain how you do them, and then I'll explain how I do them, which is going to be very similar because I kind of learned a lot from you, but
yeah,
I'm at a different level, so I do them in a little bit different way, and I also have a different way of learning
style.
Yeah. So we'll go ahead with yours, and then I'll talk about the way I do it, the differences that I have.
Yeah, I guess the first thing that I like to tell people is that practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent. So if you're doing something in a bad way over and over again, you're going to be doing it in a bad way for a very long time. So you got to be careful about habit formation.
That reminds me of when I learned to swing a kettlebell, because you'd been doing it for a while. The instructor that taught you taught me.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't teach me because you didn't want to teach me wrong.
Right.
Because you knew I wasn't going to be around for you to
correct.
Yeah.
Well, of course, part of that too is your form would change. And this actually happens with coding as well, right? You have to keep those good practices, and you have to try to keep your way of doing things coherent as you move up. Because initially, like, you'll start out and you'll write stuff and it'll be very, very procedural. And then you'll probably get more object oriented, and then you'll start doing design patterns, and then maybe you'll start doing some functional stuff, and your approach has to be structured appropriately for those things to work, but it also has to be structured in such a way that you don't create bad habits in each of those paradigms. Because if you write a lot of really procedural code, when you do OO code, it'll show. Because I can't tell you how many developers I have cleaned up after. I'm like, okay, this person wrote C in C# because of the way that they dealt with things, the way that they dealt with everything.
Do you think it's because they teach a lot of procedural? It's easy to teach procedural in colleges and universities.
It's easier to think about. The other thing is computer science programs are not actually geared for programming.
Yeah.
So it's probably different in a code camp.
That's one thing that, interestingly enough, we have an upcoming episode. Oh, it's going to be
a little
well down the road, but I want to talk about the differences in learning between what you did, which was computer science degree, what I'm doing, which is more free-form, sort of self-taught, autodidactic learning, and then we have several friends that have gone through code camps, and so I want to get one of them on to come in and we can just have a roundtable discussion about the different ways of learning and goods and bads about them.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, mine was autodidactic on top of the degree.
I think that's the case for a lot of people.
Yeah, because if you actually want to be a programmer, your degree isn't going to get you there. But it's very different, and you have to be very conscientious about the way you're structuring your practice so that you don't create problems for yourself or for other people. The other thing I pretty much always did was first thing in the morning was when I would do the kata. I've worked at different jobs. I've worked at some where they don't mind you doing light project stuff like that for drills, or they don't pay attention enough. And if you're efficient enough, they don't care. Yeah. I've also worked at other places where that would not have flown. And so I had to practice before I left the house.
Yeah.
The idea, though, is to do it fairly frequently to really, really get that practice to sink in. And so I did at least 3 times a week. Sometimes it was 5, sometimes it was 7. When I was really, really just absolutely hell-bent on trying to do test-driven development in C#, I drilled it every day. Of course, the thing is that ultimately ended up not being a thing because most places that I have worked around here, they had so many other problems they couldn't get to TDD. But, it was nice for drilling, but you want to do that enough where it actually sticks and where you can really work those practices into your daily life. Once you have actually mastered a problem, in other words, you feel like you can't squeeze any more learning out of it, then go find a new one or change this one. So like the leveling up with the, going from prime numbers to happy primes to finding the closest happy prime.
Yeah.
Those problems keep going up in difficulty, and you can do that with a lot of the code katas. You can find things that will make it more challenging, and where you have to refactor, or you have to do unit tests, or you have to even do multi-threading and things like that if that's your jam. But the idea is being able to scale it up and to have somewhat of a plan for how you're going to scale it up, and then go do that. Also, once you've just completely exhausted all opportunities like that, then pick another code kata.
Yeah, well, that makes sense.
Yeah, and then do it till you're burnt out on it, and then try the old one again, and you will be surprised at how much more you can tweak it, because you'll pick things up that you didn't realize.
I was going to say, because I'll talk about this a little bit when it gets to my stuff, but your learning style is more where you can sit and do the same thing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I can do that for a given amount of time, but I have to see an end point to that.
Yeah.
Because I get antsy.
Well, you have to set a goal.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, I can do this, and I can go completely all the way through this kata and do it the first time, with no compilation errors or anything like that, in X amount of time. And there's no way I can tighten any of it up. Then you go, okay, well, I've won this game, and then I'll move on. Like, you do have to set goals.
Okay, yeah.
Now, one thing I will point out that I do try to be especially conscious of while I'm doing these is I try to find ways to avoid using the mouse ever. And the reason for this is that your ability to actually learn commands, with the mouse, it's typically click on a menu, scroll down, click on a thing, it pops out, click on something else. Whereas with keystrokes, it's just a move and you go on. And so it's easier to build that fast reaction if you get used to not using the mouse.
So basically you're saying practice your keystrokes and what I was talking about earlier with the Visual Studio commands, practice those along with your code katas?
Yes.
Like at the same time?
Yeah, that's actually a huge function of the code kata.
Okay.
Is to get those keystrokes down, right? Because it's not just about the problem you're solving, but it's the skills that you're able to take away from repeatedly solving that problem.
Well, I could totally see that, because then if you do that during that time, you don't have to slow down your dev time trying to force yourself to learn those.
Right. And it just abstracts the problem out. Because now you have a known problem that doesn't have any weird stuff that's occupying your brain space, so that you can actually learn.
Yeah,
that's the idea of a controlled environment.
Yeah, and then I can totally see that. I had been, like I said, I've been trying to teach myself a lot of the command keys, and it's hard to do that. I could not imagine doing that at a job where I'm expected to produce code in a certain amount of time.
Yeah, because you'll have to go look it up, and then you go find it in the menu, and then you click off the menu and you press that key combination, and then the next time you got to do it again, and that will burn a lot of time, and it's especially bad as a junior developer. Yeah, senior devs can go pretty fast.
Yeah, I really like this. I hadn't put the two together.
Yeah.
And so
you're looking for, when you said earlier, this is what clarified it for me, is you're going, okay, I can't do the same thing over and over again. It's like, well, you're not doing the same thing over and over again. You're doing it in the same room.
Yeah. Okay.
Mentally, right? It's the same problem space, but I'm doing things in a different way to try to get my speed up and to get my accuracy up and all those sort of things. One other thing I do is I do try to practice in the same or similar environment to the one I do my work. So if possible, I will practice at my desk.
That makes sense.
And the idea there is that that's kind of like the whole thing of studying for a test in the room where you're going to take the test.
It actually does help you to remember,
yeah.
Or in a similar environment. I know when I was in medical school, we actually bought chairs similar to the chairs we sat in the classroom to study. I mean, they were like $200 chairs.
Yeah.
But we bought them so that we would have that similarity when we were at home after the school had closed.
Yeah. Well, and another thing too is your hardware is also going to be different. Mm-hmm. And so like on my laptop, I can be typing and I can flick my thumb over and move the mouse. Well, that's all well and good for working on this laptop. But if I want to be efficient at work with my, mouse that's away from the keyboard, that's a different environment. And that's the one I'm being judged on, not on what I can do with the laptop.
That makes sense.
So you want to get that as close as possible, at least in the early phases. Of course, the other thing I've done too is I switch my mouse hands between home and work. So I use the mouse right-handed at home and I use it left-handed at work. And one of the big benefits of that is that forces me not to rely on the mouse because it makes it always awkward.
The idea of that makes me uncomfortable to the core.
I don't switch the buttons, which is what's even weirder. So like the left mouse click is my middle finger when it's on the left hand.
Like I've got chills running up my back just thinking of that. That makes me so uncomfortable.
It makes the mouse inconvenient so that I have a preference for the keyboard. Mm-hmm. And of course I have it right-handed at home because I also like to play games some.
Yeah. You have to have the mouse.
Yeah.
For most of them, yeah.
And so being able to, that's kind of a little trick I use. The other thing too is it cuts down on the repetitive strain because I do work a lot.
Yeah.
And I seem to have more problems with my hands when I'm using the mouse a lot than when I'm using the keyboard a lot. I think just as an aside, I'm pretty well convinced from my my sample size of one that the usage of a mouse may be worse for your hands than the keyboard. I know that they really, really focus on the keyboard, but nobody focuses on the mouse. Right. We've had all these years of ergonomics about how to set up the keyboard properly and all that. But then what do people do? They reach over to the mouse.
Do you remember the old Witty balls?
Yep.
I always liked those because they were very ergonomic and
yeah.
I felt like I had more control over that.
The big ball, like
the ball, the brand that my dad had was called the Witty ball.
Okay.
But it was like basically you set your hand down on it and then you could turn it with your thumb or your forefinger and then you had the buttons over here too. And I was like, I just always liked that better even than a mouse because I felt like I had more control.
Yeah. But I really do think that the mouse is probably part of the RSI problem. Mm-hmm. If nothing else, at least with your hands rested, you can rest your hands. I know that they tell you got to keep it up and all that. Those are people that don't type all day. They move around and they research people that type all day because if you type all day, you can't do that. It's going to jack up your shoulders like no other. No. So that's kind of my focus on that is, obviously regular schedule of practice and then trying to set things up so that I don't fall into bad habits the rest of the time either, which is why I switched the mouse hands, which sounds absolutely insane. I'm aware that it does.
Yeah, that makes sense. I do a lot of similar things now. Obviously, the ones that I questioned Will about are ones that I didn't even know he did because I haven't actually spent a whole lot of time with you at the office at work.
Well, and you haven't sat there and watched me do code katas either because I will say it's like watching paint dry, but it's
quite similar.
Yeah, it's not particularly entertaining, and usually when you've been over here, I'm working on something because my code kata practice is something I take very privately, I guess, and I don't even really know why. It just feels like it's something that's supposed to be personal. Yeah,
well, it creates by you making it personal. You create for yourself an environment where it is comfortable and safe for you to make mistakes without other people seeing them and judging you and you feeling...
It's a bedroom, not a boardroom.
Yes, exactly.
That maybe is a better way to put it. It's okay to be with yourself doing these. Like I don't know of a better way to put it. It is a very personal thing, the way I do my code katas. And a lot of that is structured around the fact that I am going to screw up and do things the wrong way, or I'm going to try some wild hair idea to see if I can do things faster, and it's completely okay.
Yeah.
And so I want to establish that emotional space where that can work.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I kind of do the same thing, though. I do most of my work from home anyway, so I've got that set up anyways.
Yeah, you got that going for you.
Yeah. But with mine, I tend to choose an existing kata. I've got several resources, and I'm going to put some in the show notes of places that have really great, just katas, or things like what I did for the Code Newbie event. But I'll tend to do it for about a week or so every day, and if I'm getting bored with it, make one up that's similar or add something to it. Like, I took the primes kata that I've been doing for a while and added the happy numbers to it to make happy primes, which, I started doing the primes kata so that I could get good enough at that to add the happy numbers to it.
Yeah.
Because I was wanting to do a happy primes thing because of Doctor Who, but and like I said, as a junior developer, still really much in the learning process, I do these every day, like every morning. And as I'm trying to learn like back end and front end, I'll do the same kata, but in a different language. So, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'll do the kata in C#, and then Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, I'll do it in JavaScript. And Sundays, I'm usually mowing the lawn, so I'm not.
Yeah. Now, one thing you do want to make sure when you're doing that, and I'm pretty sure that you do this, but I want to throw this out there for the listeners. You do need to use the specific idioms for that language and that particular paradigm. So, if you're doing object-oriented programming in C# and then you're going, okay, I'm going to implement the same thing in JavaScript. JavaScript inheritance is not the same. And the object patterns, the patterns are not the same.
The solutions, and this is what...
You have to be idiomatic.
Yeah. And this is one of the things that it helps with the neuroplasticity of learning the languages is I want to do the same thing in JavaScript that I'm doing in C#, but not the same way.
Right.
Like the output is still going to be the same. I'm going to produce a list of happy primes. But the way that I get there is going to be different in C# than in JavaScript.
Yeah. And you can also do it in different sets in the same language as well. Because there are more than, there's multiple ways to solve a problem. Because an iterative way of doing it, like, okay, so like the way I solved the happy primes problem, I used link and I used recursion. There were some issues around the way that I did that if it was over a very large set. Yeah. That would be really, really bad. Because of, just because of, memory utilization and things like that. So you may want to practice doing it different ways. Like you may want to do it iteratively, or instead of doing recursion, you may want to push the numbers that you get onto a stack or onto a queue or something like that and iterate over it. I guess it's still iteratively, but instead of it's iteration instead of recursion, or instead of doing language integrated query, like doing some kind of, streaming type thing or multi-threading or, anything along those lines, like your constructs are going to be different, even though it's the same language. Yeah, exactly. And also sometimes a kata won't work in one language or the other. Right. Most of them, if they're good katas, they're going to work in any Turing complete language. Yeah, they will. Although some things are extremely painful. Oh yeah, I'm not saying they're not painful. I'm just saying that a good kata should, and that's something we didn't mention earlier, but it should. But what I'll do is I'll have a handful of katas that I rotate through. So I'll do one week, and then the next week I'll do a different one, and it'll be like 3 or 4, and then I'll go back. Yeah, you do shorter iterations. I do, and that's just a personality difference. Yeah. Well, and the other thing too, I think, is you're still learning on the katas as well. Like you have two processes going on. You have the process of I'm doing this kata, and then you have the meta process of how do I do a kata? Yes. And what am I learning as I'm, how do I structure my learning? And some of that you're going to tweak one way or another as you go along, because I used to do it shorter. This is why I wanted to talk about the way I do it after you talked about the way you do it, because I knew
after reading through yours, I was like, I need to say how I do things, because yours is really great for a mid to senior level developer,
right?
But junior and still, like in school learning, you're going to want to do it more the way I do it, because I'm at that level too.
Well, and the other thing too is keeping you from getting bored and keeping you from getting discouraged.
Yes.
There is that side of things. We like to act like there isn't, but that makes a huge difference. Plus, you just got to cover a lot of territory, frankly.
Yeah.
Just to get that first job, it's a pretty significant expansion of your abilities across a broad discipline. Whereas I'm expected to go in depth on something. So, like, I might do code katas with expression trees, like parsing expression trees and trying to turn them into different languages. Like, okay, I want to parse this and I want to express it as JSON, and I want to express it as HTML, and I want to express it as SQL, and render it differently and be able. Like, I've done that not all that long ago, and that's a whole nother can of worms. Obviously the cycles on that were a bit longer because there's a lot of patterns and things that I had to really, really play with. Whereas on the shorter term side of, okay, I need to process a list of integers, you can kind of take that down a notch, and you should. It's honestly what it reminds me of is the way education works, because you think about, you cover a pretty broad range of stuff in school, and then eventually you get to the point where you specialize. You're still trying to get, you're broadening your range, but if you're not a liberal arts major, you only take so many liberal arts classes. Like if you're trying to get your PhD in math, you're not going to be taking a whole lot of, history classes or things like that.
English lit.
Yeah. You get one or two, but then you really, really deeply specialize. And I think that transition is probably the way that it should go. There's a lot of things wrong with their educational system, but that seems to be pretty well on point.
It's too bad. Well, I don't say it's too bad, but it's interesting because I'm at that junior level, and I would think that point that you're talking about is more of at something that you hit around mid-level.
Yeah.
And you're past that point.
Right. It's mid to upper mid.
Yeah. I think it would be interesting if we had someone on here that was at that level. Unfortunately, I don't even think I know anyone that's a mid to upper mid level.
Yeah. The thing is with development, there's a very small middle.
Yeah.
Like, people are either green or they're good enough where they can pretend to not be green. I know some senior developers that I would not classify as senior, even though some of them have got over a decade of experience. They have 10 of the same years. And so they're good enough that they don't make the obvious junior mistakes, but the mid-level mistakes are different and they're deeper. They're structural problems, and so they don't get noticed as much, and so you get passed off as a senior.
Well, I think it's something we've said in the past too, and when you first start off, you start off with, in martial arts, you learn the basic katas.
Yep. I remember first basic from Wado-Ryu when I was 7 years old. And
you learn that, and you drill that the entire time you're doing it.
Yep.
All right. Well, with coding, you learn the basics. The stuff that you're going to use day in and day out, syntax and things like that. Then you get to mid-level and you start adding complexity, and you do more and more complex stuff at mid-level, and you start noticing patterns and things like that. And then you get to the upper levels and you go back to the basics.
And you refine them.
Yes. And you refine them. And I see that I kind of see that with you. Like, you're doing the same kind of kata that I'm doing as a junior, but you're doing it at a much different level than me.
Yeah. And trying to make it as terse as possible, because, the searching through a list, like, I want to be able to do that with as few keystrokes as I possibly can. And I know another developer who really doesn't like the way I code because I make it terser than he is comfortable with.
Yeah.
But it's because of that refined, constant practice that I'm able to do that. And it's not that I'm writing it where it's not clear. It's just that this individual has not quite made the leap to where that's okay.
And I think, like I'm saying, I think that is, with these code katas, this is something that you should start doing very early on, even as you're still learning to code, because they can help you to learn and to get to develop good practices and good skills if done properly. And it's something that you can do throughout your career. You get to that mid-level, you start expanding and making them more and more complex. And then you get to that upper senior level. And this is something that you need to do. It's not like you can go, okay, well, I'm a junior. I'm doing, the simple ones. I'm doing things simply, and I'm just going to, skip over the mid-level and skip adding the complexity to go into, all right, I'm just going to stay doing simple things, and just refine that simplicity.
Right.
That
doesn't get you there.
No, it doesn't. You have to go through that path, because the way you get to that senior developer understanding of how things work is by making them more complex and then coming back. Because I know in martial arts, this is something that you and our martial arts instructor in college had a long time getting through my thick skull.
Yeah.
Because you'd been doing it for so long and I was brand new to it. I wanted to be, I'm like, oh, well, we're learning the same things.
Yeah.
We should be equal. And it's like, no, you'd been doing it since you were 7. I'd been doing it since I was 20.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Cause you turned 21.
Yeah.
It is weird because you will get to a point where like the mid-tier problems start to show you where you are weak on the lower end. Mm-hmm. It's like it's just a really strange. It's like the structural weakness comes out.
Well, as you add more complexity to what you're doing,
you break things.
And you see where you really. It was almost like in martial arts where when you're young you can strength your way through it.
Yeah.
And
as you get older, you can't, and so you have to get better or you have to get out.
Yeah. Exactly.
And I think honestly that's part of the reason that developer turnover is so bad is they are trying to a pretty substantial portion of the population is not trying to make themselves more efficient. They're trying to brute force their way through development. Mm-hmm. And it works until it stops working, and then it stops working horribly.
Exactly. And it's like an aging martial artist.
Yeah.
You either get really good at structure and become like some of our instructors that were, in their 50s and 60s and could throw us 20-something-year-olds around.
Yeah.
Like nobody's business. Or
I remember getting hit sometimes.
Oh, yeah. Or you stop doing it because
you can't take the injuries anymore.
Yeah. Exactly.
And that tends to be because you're trying to use too much force to accomplish a goal that's easier with less force.
That pretty much wraps everything up. Will, before we close everything out, what do you have for us this week for Tricks of the Trade?
Well, I want to have a reminder here that usually when there's a problem, there's actually 2 problems. And the first one is the problem you're actually trying to solve. And the second is how you're thinking about the problem. And this kind of comes out with the whole code kata thing, because as you're working your way through it, not only are you trying to solve the initial problem of what that code kata actually is and how you're going to work to optimize your workflow, but you also have to be thinking about how you optimize the optimization of your workflow. You have to be able to try to do that at the same time. And this is kind of tricky for a lot of developers and it's kind of tricky for everybody, frankly. I have a lot of problems with this, especially if I'm emotionally attached to what I'm doing. It's very hard to step back. And so I would like to throw this out there that a lot of the way that you are thinking about a problem makes solving the problem more or less difficult versus the actual problem itself. So that's what I've got.
For Titanfall.
If you have a question or comment for us, please email us at neckbeards@CompleteDeveloperPodcast.com. Our theme music is an excerpt from Stand By for Titanfall by Pure Bells, available on SoundCloud and licensed under Creative Commons. The intro music for IoTs is Hillbilly Hip Hop by Jason Belcher. For references, show notes, and to sign up to our email list, be sure and check out the website at CompleteDeveloperPodcast.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at CompleteDevPod and like our page on Facebook to keep up with the news about the show. Thanks for listening. See you next time.